give just another minute here or so for everyone to get that was in the waiting room to get into the presentation. Good afternoon, everyone. I think it's about time that we get started, and welcome to the MAP Talk on Tucson's economy sails into uncertain waters. I'm Jennifer Pullen, the MAP Dashboard Coordinator, a Senior Research Economist in the Economic and Business Research Center at the University of Arizona's Eller College of Management. I'm joined today with Laura Shaw, the Senior Vice President of Sun Corridor Incorporated, and George Hammond, the Director of the Economic and Business Research Center at the University of Arizona. We have a great series of presentations set up for you today, but first let's talk a little bit about the logistics of today's meeting. So all of our MAP talks are recorded. We will record this, we will publish it on the MAP dashboard probably sometime tomorrow. And then we encourage you, if you find the information presented today valuable, to visit the MAP website, share that recording with your colleagues. You can also sign up for our MAP newsletter if you haven't already. We'll send out that recording sometime within the next month, and you can forward that on to your colleagues. If you're interested in signing up, all you need to do is visit the MAP dashboard. That's mapaz-dashboard.arizona.edu. Scroll down to the bottom and there's a subscribe for updates box there. You just put in your name, first name, last name, and your email address. Today's presentation will be in conference mode. That means everyone will be muted except the presenters. We will have time for question and answer at the end. So if you have any questions during the three presentations, please just go ahead and enter them into the chat button at the bottom or into the Q&A button at the bottom. I'll be monitoring the question and answers throughout the presentation, and then we'll have plenty of time at the end for us to kind of go through our panelists and have them answer your questions. You can also email Valerie Rice, who also works in the Economic and Business Research Center, at any time. Her email is listed here on the slide. If you have any problems, communication problems, or if you have a question, you can send that to her. And that's vhrice@arizona.edu. Before we get started, we'd like to thank our MAP sponsors and partners. Without their contributions, the MAP, this event today wouldn't be possible. The MAP dashboard itself wouldn't be possible. Our sustaining sponsors include Tucson Electric Power, the Thomas R. Brown Family Foundation, the Freeport McMoran Foundation. Our partners include the Community Foundation for Southern Arizona, Pima Association of Governments, Southern Arizona Leadership Council, Sun Corridor Incorporated, and the University of Arizona. Additionally, we have a media partnership with the Arizona Daily Star, and they publish a business section feature the last Sunday of each month on the front page of the business section. And the first Monday of each month, you can find a MAP related health feature in the Arizona Daily Star. We encourage you to look for those. So now I'd like to welcome Dr. George Hammond. He's going to kick off the first presentation for us here. So George, if you could please start your video. Right. Welcome, George.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Jennifer. It's good to see everyone here today. Thanks so much for joining. Here today is to give you an overview of the outlook for Phoenix and Tucson, focused primarily on Tucson, of course. So let me share my slides, and you should be seeing them now. So let's jump in and start by having a look at the key topics for the day. First order of business, try and convince you that the U.S. economy did not enter into a recession in early 2022. And as we do that, I'll give you an overview of how economists think about recessions, what we think a recession is, and how we measure these things, and a feel for why it takes time for us to make a determination about when the economy has actually entered a recession and when it's left a downturn. Once we've talked about that, we'll talk about inflation. And as you know, inflation is running very hot nationally, but it's also running very hot, in fact, even hotter here in Arizona. And I'll show you in particular what's going on up in Phoenix, but I think we're experiencing something pretty similar down here in Tucson. So Arizona's labor market remains very tight. If you're trying to hire at the moment, you know this very well. We are working on hiring here in the Economic and Business Research Center, and it's really a struggle. So what we're seeing, very low unemployment rates, in some cases historically low unemployment rates, rapidly rising wages, and just a mountain of open jobs here in Arizona and really across the nation. Now, the baseline forecast calls for continued growth here in Tucson, and that's still the most likely scenario, but downside risks are elevated. In fact, the probability of a pessimistic scenario or a scenario that includes a U.S. recession is almost as likely continued growth. So, we're headed into uncertain waters. So let's talk about recessions. Now, the recessions that at least the recession dates that economists pay the most attention to are defined by the National Bureau of Economic Research. And this is just a private, nonprofit association of economists. And it's been around a long time. It goes back to the 1920s. And some of the earliest research on cycles, recessions, expansions, goes back to the National Bureau of Economic Research, again in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. So the recession timing that most economists pay attention to comes out of the NBER, and in particular out of a group at the NBER called the Business Cycle Dating Committee, and it's composed of a group of eminent economists who look at the data and make a decision what month a recession began and what month a recession ended. And these dates go back to 1850. So they've been doing this for a long time, not quite back to 1850, but since the 1920s and 30s at least. So what is a recession? A recession is a substantial decline in the level of economic activity. And the key word there is level. So a slowdown in growth is not enough. The level of economic activity, however we happen to be measuring it, has to decline. And in particular, a recession must have a particular depth, diffusion, and duration. So it must be deep enough. It must be spread out enough across industries and types of economic activity, and it must last long enough in order to be classified as a recession. So what's the benchmark there? Well, the benchmark is the mildest prior downturn. So that's just the rule of thumb. But keep in mind, as I note here, that there are no fixed rules. So they'll trade off one rule for if need be. So one of the most important things to keep in mind here is that this is a backward-looking classification. The NBER won't call a recession until they're sure that the economy has in fact peaked. And that will be, 3, 4, 5, 6 months, maybe sometimes a year after the recession has actually begun. So this is not where you look for a real-time declaration that a recession has begun. The good news here is that these recession begin and end dates do not affect public policy at the state, federal, or local level. Have nothing to do with that. No public policy depends on the NBER's decision. So they take their time, they get it right. They only make that designation once, and they don't go back and revise it once they make that determination. So overall, the NBER Business Cycle Dating Committee uses data from a lot of different sources, a huge amount of data that they'll look at. But there are really 6 monthly time series that they'll really look at closely. And within those 6, there are 2 that are the most important. But they're going to look at a lot of different data sets, including real GDP. So what's our past history? Well, I put together the data on the average length of recessions and expansions since World War II. The average recession has lasted 10 months. The average expansion has lasted a little over 5 years. So just something to keep in mind as we head towards these uncertain few months. So identifying peaks and troughs in real time is difficult. So I put together this little visualization for you to kind of give you a feel for what's going on. So imagine that we're tracking a measure of economic activity, whatever that might be. In the past, we've noticed a peak, which is where it reaches a high and then declines, and a trough is where it reaches a low and then subsequently rises. But where we are now is something that looks a little bit more like this. Are we at a peak? And the answer is maybe, but maybe not. The NBER is going to wait until they're sure to declare that a peak, because something like that might happen. So here's one of the key monthly time series that the NBER will track. This is U.S. non-farm payroll jobs, seasonally adjusted data through August of 2022. And I gave you a little bar there to show you the beginning of the year, January of 2022. And notice that it just steadily increases through August. So there's no indication from this key measure that the U.S. economy has fallen into recession. If we had, typically this would be trending down. It's not trending down, it's continued to trend up. So no recession signal there. The second key measure is this U.S. real personal income less transfers. So this includes, wages and salaries, fringe benefits, proprietors' income. It includes asset income like dividends, interest, and rent. What it does not include is Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment insurance payments, economic stimulus payments, Paycheck Protection Program payments. All that is removed from this time series. Now, for this, it goes through July of 2022. And this looks a little flatter, actually quite a bit flatter, and a little more choppy. But overall, it has continued to increase. So at least no strong signal from this series either that the economy has peaked and begun to trend down. And if I were to show you the other 4 indicators, which are things like, industrial production, real consumption, spending, other measures like manufacturing and trade sales. For the most part, there is no significant downward trend there either. They look a lot more like what we're seeing here for U.S. real personal income less transfers. So overall, the U.S. economy was not in recession during the first half of the year. So the other hot topic these days is inflation, as you know very well. Overall, national inflation has been running at the fastest pace in 40 years. The latest data is for August. Over the year, consumer price index for all items was up 8.3%. The core index, which excludes food and energy, was up 6.3%. Well, the fastest pace of increase that we've seen in 40 years. So inflation is running really rapidly, but it's running even faster in Phoenix. So over the year, the consumer all items consumer price index was up 13% in August, much faster than the national pace at 8.3%. So inflation is running much faster in Phoenix than it is nationally. And, the big question is why is that happening? And there are a variety of ways to kind of break down or disaggregate this consumer price index data. One way is to, as we've seen before, is to exclude, food and energy, and look, in other words, look at core inflation. If I were to show you that graph, Phoenix inflation by a core measure is also running much faster than it is nationally. So it's not food and energy that's driving Phoenix all items inflation up above the national average. Another way we can break it down, commodities versus services. So commodities are typically things that we can touch, like cars, apparel, other tangible goods that we might buy as part of our everyday lives. And if we look at commodities inflation in Phoenix, it's running at about the same pace as the nation. So it's not commodities inflation that's driving it. It's really what's going on in services. And the key thing to keep in mind about services in the consumer price index is that is where housing is included. What's going on with rents, with what's going on in the cost of owner-occupied housing, all of that is in the services component of the consumer price index. And housing is by far the biggest single component, the most important component in the overall all items index. And within housing, the biggest component of that is shelter. So this includes rent. It includes owner-occupied rent and a couple other smaller components. The reason that Phoenix inflation is running at such a fast rate compared to the nation is because shelter inflation is running so much faster. As you can see here, the shelter index in Phoenix was up 19% over the year in August. Nationally, it was 6.2%. So, shelter inflation in Phoenix was running at triple the national rate. And that's why inflation in Phoenix, and really I think across Arizona, is running at a much faster pace than it is nationally. Jennifer will take you through some more of the data that's driving what we're seeing in that shelter consumer price index when she gives her presentation. So overall, inflation is running rapidly across the US. It's particularly fast here in Arizona. And what's driving that is what's going on with house prices and the housing market. So let's talk about the labor market. Overall, Arizona, the national labor market, Arizona's labor market, and Tucson's labor market is really tight. On a seasonally adjusted basis, employment rate in August was 3.5%, just below the national average. As you can see from the graph, that's close to the all-time lows that we've ever seen, going back to 1990 in Tucson's unemployment rate. For Arizona, the unemployment is near all-time lows going back to 1976 and probably even further than that. So, the labor market is really tight. And even if we look at a very broad, expansive measure of employment rates, the U6 rate that you see there on the third line for the nation, that really delves down into the labor market, into people who aren't kind of consistently participating in the labor market. Maybe they're part-time for economic reasons. They're not really attached to the labor force the same way that people in the official rate are. So even there, the U6 rate, this very broad unemployment rate, is at the lowest levels that we've seen in decades. So it's very difficult hiring conditions out there. So how's Tucson doing in terms of recovering from the pandemic shock? Well, we're about back to where we were just before the pandemic began. We're not quite there, but we're close. According to the latest data, we're 99.3% recovered. So it's close, but not quite there. Tucson is behind Phoenix. Phoenix recovered all of the jobs lost during those first 2 months about the middle of last year. The state of Arizona as a whole did that at the end of last year. Tucson is almost there, a little bit behind the state and Phoenix. So in terms of Tucson jobs by industry, this shows the net change from February 2020 to August 2022. And notice that, professional and business services jobs is way behind where it was before the pandemic began. It's not really clear what's driving that. The sector that accounts for most of that job loss is the one that includes call centers, employment agents, and services to buildings like janitorial services and things like that. It's not clear really what's driving that at the moment. It could be a change or a shift in the way that jobs in those sectors are reporting, if they've switched to sort of a contract relationship away from employees on payrolls, and that might be part of the story, but we just don't know for sure yet. We're still digging into that. Overall government jobs are still down compared to where they were before. And most of those are state and local education jobs. Education and health is a little bit down. That got hit early in the pandemic. Information jobs, where some high-tech jobs are located, as well as kind of your local cell phone store would be in there as well. Also includes publishing, communications jobs like TV and radio reporters would be there as well. Overall construction jobs are back to where they were before the pandemic began. Encouragingly, leisure and hospitality jobs are above where they were before the pandemic started. But where we've seen the most job growth through the pandemic has been in trade, transportation, and utilities. And that's really been driven by transportation and warehousing with some help from retail trade. And of course, that's connected to trends that predated the pandemic, where Arizona was already growing transportation and warehousing jobs. But certainly the pandemic turbocharged that. So with a really tight labor market, we expect to see rapidly rising wages. The best measure, I think, is the employment cost index. We unfortunately don't have data here for Tucson, but we do have data for Phoenix. These are over the year growth rates. You can see that before the pandemic began, Phoenix was experiencing faster employment cost growth. And, this includes wages and salaries, as well as fringe benefits. And importantly, it's also adjusted for shifts in employment across occupations and industries. But, Phoenix was already seeing relatively rapid wage growth before the pandemic. It's really picked up both nationally and in Phoenix over the quarters. For the second quarter, the most recent data, we were seeing over the year increases both nationally and in Phoenix of 5.5%. That's really fast. It's the fastest that we have in this data set going back to 2006. But unfortunately, that doesn't keep up with inflation. Inflation in Phoenix in the second quarter was up around 9%. Okay, let's talk about the outlook. And this is the summary of the latest Tucson forecast, and it's a base. So this assumes no U.S. recession during this period. And what you see is that non-farm job growth accelerates in 2022. That reflects the fact that we're, spent most of 2022 still recovering from the pandemic. As we get into next year, that growth will slow because we'll have been recovered from the pandemic. Also, the national economy under baseline assumptions will slow pretty significantly. So we go into 2024 and beyond, overall job growth slows even more, primarily driven by trends, namely the aging of the baby boom generation, as we'll see. Personal income growth essentially stops in 2022. What's driving that is just the fact that the federal pandemic-related income support is now gone, and that has really driven income growth during 2020 and 2021. It's gone now, so overall income growth is really going to slow, but it picks back up at a fairly rapid pace, reflecting the fact that we're, at least under baseline assumptions, we still have relative labor markets. Overall retail plus remote sales, so these are taxable sales, that slows, sort of a similar pattern to income as you would expect. But it takes a little bit longer for that to slow down, partly because a big chunk of the income support, that federal pandemic-related income support, was saved. So, households and consumers will run down those balances before they begin to significantly cut back spending. Overall population growth is this year and into next year, and then starts to slow again, driven by overall demographic trends. Housing permits really strong in 2022, but then gradually slow down. The model requires that those, that overall housing permit activity be consistent with the population growth. So as population growth slows, housing permits come back into line with that slower population gain. Overall, Tucson and U.S. job growth. Tucson is, I think, going to outpace the nation in terms of job growth going forward over the next 30 years. But we are going to see a pretty substantial slowdown again, even under baseline assumptions. In terms of population growth is faster than what we'll see nationally, but much slower than what we've seen over the past 30 years. A big part of what drives that is what you see going on with natural increase on this graph. Natural increase is just the annual difference between births and deaths. And notice that goes from a tailwind, during the past 30, 40 years, even further back, to a headwind. So it's going to slow growth because Tucson is now experiencing more deaths than births each year. And that's going to continue as we look forward over the next 30 years due to the overall aging of our population as the baby boom generation ages. So that migration is going to be the sole source of population growth in Tucson. The same thing is going to happen in Phoenix, although sometime in the next decade, and the state will be in the same boat. This is not something that's specific to Arizona. It's something we're seeing across the nation and indeed across the world, particularly this demographic aging. So overall, Tucson's population growth continues to outpace the nation, but it's entirely driven by net migration. So the key takeaways today: inflation is still rapid and it'll be slow to accelerate. And that's because housing or shelter-driven inflation has a lot of momentum to it because of the way it's measured in the index. So it's going to take, at least until next year or sometime in 2024 for that shelter inflation to really get back to where it was before the pandemic began. Overall, Tucson's labor market is still tight. Under baseline assumption, it remains fairly tight, but it will gradually loosen as the economy slows. Now, the big for growth to continue, but you want to keep in mind that a national downturn is almost as likely. What would a national downturn mean for Tucson? Well, the current projections assume that if the U.S. economy falls into recession, it would be something along the lines of what we experienced in the late 70s and early 80s. Now, those were pretty severe national downturns, but they were nothing like what we went through during the Great Recession. So overall, that would probably mean a significant slowdown in Tucson's growth, but overall, it tends to respond a bit less than the national economy does to recessions. In the long run, Tucson is well positioned to outpace U.S. growth, but paying attention to educational attainment and water sustainability is going to continue to be a key concern as we look forward over the next 30 years. So with that, I'll conclude my remarks and throw it back to Jennifer.
Thank you, George. That was a really great presentation. And if you have questions for George, I know several of you have already put them in the chat. Please go ahead and put them in there now. We'll jot them down and we'll ask George those questions at the end. But now I'd like to welcome Laura Shaw, Senior Vice President at Sun Corridor Incorporated. And if you'd like to start your video and your slides.
Hello, everyone. So nice to be with you here today. I'm going to start my presentation and assume that all of you can see that. Thank you, George, for such great information on where we are right now with our wider economy. So now I'm here to where we are with business attraction and expansion efforts within our economy, which is what Sun Corridor's focus is on the core of a region's economic foundation, which is called primary job development. So let's just dive right in. For those of you who do not know who we are the region's main economic development agency charged with business attraction and expansion. And you'll see on the slide, we have some key tenets here about how we operate. The first is a region first approach. come to us with plans for expansion. They want to evaluate the entire Tucson and Southern Arizona region. And so we work with our jurisdictional partners as well as other regional partners to ensure they receive the information they need to move their decision process forward. So why is regional cooperation really, really important in our business? Well, every new hire that a company makes will live here and very likely cross multiple jurisdictional lines to get from their home to their job or every day. So you might live in Sahuarita and go to Raytheon every day. You might live in the city of Tucson and commute to Roche in Oro Valley every day. You might live in Marana and have a job down in South Tucson or one of our jurisdictions south. So every citizen's activity impacts all of us, whether they're going to their jobs or attending a U of A football game, they're eating in a neighboring restaurant, or going downtown to a play. So we are really focused on the region. We're a one-stop shop for our clients and site selectors nationally, and we take very seriously our job of shepherding Southern Arizona projects for all of us. So the team of all of us that we work with includes the state, it includes Arizona Commerce Authority, it includes all of our jurisdictional partners, the city, the county, the other towns, TEP, Southwest Gas, our higher education partners, U of A, Pima Community College, ASU. We work with all of these groups because all of these groups are important to our clients' business. For private and nonprofit, you'll hear later that we can go under NDAs. Most of the jurisdictions as public agencies with taxpayer funds cannot do that for our clients. And our clients are very serious about confidentiality and about NDAs because they don't want their competition knowing where they're looking to grow their business. And I'm sure you all can understand that. So we do have a contract with a government organization, Pima County, which also serves our entire region. And in addition, 75% of our funding comes from the private sector. And that's very important as well. Our clients want to talk to their peers here in the community. And finally, we're industry driven. So because most of our funding is from the private sector, we are led by those investors that believe in that regional approach to economic development. So what is our mission? What are we actually doing to attract business? Well, our mission is to generate community wealth. And I'll take you through the slide really from a high level point of view. When a new company comes into the market, they hire what's called primary direct jobs. So these companies are starting up and exporting a product or service outside our market and then bringing new money back into our market. This is different than a retail operation. So we're really focused on primary non-retail direct jobs. The result of these jobs, if a Roche, for example, hires 100 people, those 100 people then influence the industry. The ripple effect starts to happen in the community. These new hires will build a home, they will hire lawyers, they will go out to restaurants that some of you may run. They will do all sorts of activities that, because they're here in the market, they're adding to that level of our economy. And then finally, increase tax revenue. So all of this activity, direct jobs, indirect jobs, will increase the tax revenue base, increase the tax base, the state, the counties, the cities, the towns. So this is very important as a core lesson for you to understand what Suncorder Inc. does versus activities in the wider economy. So for us, we act as a sales and marketing agency to attract these new companies, these new jobs, new talent, and new capital investment. And when we bring in these new businesses and help businesses expand, this benefits you as existing businesses because we will provide you with new customer prospects, new suppliers, new potential partners in your own growth plans. So what we do at this will create a stronger economy in this ripple effect to ultimately attract professionals to move here and to stay here. Sorry, you may be hearing rain here. It's raining up here at our offices. So let's go on to who are we trying to attract in this mission? And you'll see here on this slide, there are 4 key targeted industries that we have followed for many, many years now, driven by our economic blueprint back when Suncord Inc. was founded as TRIO. In 2007, we did a plan, and this plan includes these targeted industries. And the reason we pick these is that they match the current assets that we have to offer these industries, such as workforce and other assets that we have that I'll cover later. But we can sell to these industries. We have the assets, we're developing the assets, and this provides us the best opportunity for long-term success. And they're also high-paying industries. And so our goal is to attract the best high-paying jobs we can for our citizens. It doesn't mean we don't work with primary industries beyond these, and you'll see in a minute that we are already starting to, but these are the primary ones. And I'll run through them real quickly. You can get more information about them on our website, but aerospace and defense, this is our granddaddy of all industries. We've been very strong in this for decades, driven by Raytheon, but also driven by about 200 other companies who operate in this region, both as Raytheon suppliers or in the commercial aerospace field. Transportation and logistics, George talked about e-commerce. Location, borrowing from a retail term. We sit right there in the middle between California and Mexico. We also are on one of the only 3 cross-country freeways called I-10 that is the only all-weather freeway that connects coast to coast, where population growth in the US is happening fast. So George, even though he said population growth is slowing, we have demonstrated very good, strong population growth to clients over many, many years. And so are the Sunbelt states. So that I-10 freeway is actually a big selling point for us. And we also have the Port of Tucson in this industry. Third is bioscience and healthcare. We're anchored by Roche up in Oro Valley in the diagnostic space. We have tremendous assets in this area, anchored by Roche, U of A College of Medicine, and Tech Launch Arizona, many, many assets. 100+ startups operate in this space, and so we can really work in this space well. And then finally, renewable technology. So we have a long history in mining technology with companies like Modular Mining and Hexagon, whose genesis can be traced right back to the University of Arizona, and then recently Caterpillar's expansion. So we're well known in the mining and technology industry as a real emerging market to be in. So when we work with clients in these industries, what do we really provide to them? As I said before, the privacy and confidentiality is really key. Most companies are very adamant about that confidentiality. We also provide specialized data services. We can do a lot of research and specific customized data for our clients, and that's very important. Coordination with regional partners is super important. Our clients want to go to just one place where they can really access the entire community and whatever they need, and they tell us project after project after project that we can fill that role better than anybody, and we do. We have a board and a chairman circle filled with all of our, and it's very, very important to show that. Preliminary incentives evaluation, our business development team, many of you may know, are real experts on the incentives available, both locally and statewide. And then I come in whenever companies want to announce, because these companies need to hire workforce, right? So we want to make sure they know, and the community knows that they're in business here. Finally, moving on to what are some of the successes we've seen in the last year. You'll see 3 companies on this slide: Eurofins, Reglogene, and Steel Jupiter. You'll see 2 logistics companies. Amazon's 5 locations here now. In the last 4 or 5 years, we've worked closely with Amazon on each of those locations. We also have PackDash from Chicago. We have 2 defense companies, Leonardo, which will now have a new presence in Oro Valley, Power Photonic down in Sarita. And then finally, Imperial Brown, which is a manufacturer serving the food service and pharmaceuticals, and they'll be down by the airport. So in attracting these companies, you're probably wondering, what are we really selling? What are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? What are our challenges? I would say the strengths of our community, we're still growing in population. Yes, it's slow down, but we are part of the growing states that have seen net in-migration over last several decades. And so this is in relation to, say, the Midwest, which is population. So in the competition for talent, it's really important to be in a region that is adding talent. Secondly, we remain a relatively inexpensive place to do business. Yes, while costs have risen, they've also increased all across the US. So relative to our peers, we're still in the game. We have a favorable tax and regulatory environment when compared to many other states, particularly California, where we continue to see a number of companies evaluating our region from California. And then finally, University of Arizona, Pima Community College, they both have excellent reputations nationally. And ASU's Tucson presence and their strength and growth statewide really also makes a difference. So companies know these schools will provide the talent they need, both now and in the future. There are some opportunities. I'm a marketing person, they're weaknesses, but I'll call them opportunities. We still struggle with the inventory of industrial and spec buildings that are under construction to meet the demands of companies who are seeking manufacturing or distribution space. We've seen this grow in the last few years, but we still have many projects that we can't fill the space requirements, or we have to get very creative about them. Secondly, we have very few large tracts, 50 acres or more of privately owned land with the type of industrial zoning that is needed for large manufacturing projects. Much of that land is owned by federal, state, and local governments. And so we see opportunity to activate that land that is not already slated for parks or preservation, especially several state land and some locally owned government land. And then finally, as George said earlier, we really do need to increase educational attainment, get more high school students who may not be going to a four-year college to seek career and technical education through institutions like Pima Community College and others. Most of the large manufacturing projects, considering our region, need middle skill workers, which means they need skills beyond high school, but potentially not a four-year degree. So let's talk about our current pipeline. We do act as a sales and marketing group. So we have a pipeline. We track all of our projects very carefully and specifically. Right now we have about 65 plus qualified projects in our pipeline. Qualified projects to us are, we have done due diligence on the company. We know that they're a real inquiry, not just kicking the tires. And that those projects are really good matches for us in terms of business development. So 65 to 70 is about normal for us. Right now, more than half of these are seeking a build-to-suit option or understand that build-to-suit might be the only option, which is interesting because prior to the pandemic, the percentage of clients seeking this versus existing inventory was reversed. In our fiscal year a couple of years ago, 34% were seeking build-to-suit and 66% existing. You can see that inventory of industrial buildings is really affecting the pipeline. And then finally, more than 90% of opportunities represent business attraction projects, companies that don't don't right now have a presence in the market. And prior to the pandemic, that was actually quite reversed. About 75% of our pipeline back then was business attraction versus 90% now. So we're attractive. Let's put it that way to outside companies. So seeing in this pipeline, the trends that we're seeing in this pipeline are listed here on this slide. Industrial really dominates our pipeline. 90% of it is in industrial. In the second visual, you'll see a decrease in aerospace and defense projects. You know, prior to the pandemic, aerospace and defense was consistently 25 to 30% of our pipeline. Now it's down to about 10%. And what we're seeing a dramatic increase of is automotive. So prior to the pandemic, it might have been 3% of our pipeline. But the number of projects in the automotive industry now outnumbers our aerospace and defense projects, almost 2 to 1. And so what you're asking yourself is, what automotive projects are we talking about? This includes EV related manufacturing. It includes other emerging automotive technologies. You might have heard about the Pony AI announcement. Those kinds of technologies are interested in Tucson. And then on the conductor, you know, Phoenix has grown quite dramatically in this space, the Intel expansion and the Taiwanese company semiconductor project up there. A lot of that interest is starting to now spill down into Tucson. We now have as many projects in this industry as we do in aerospace and defense. And we're sitting very well to attract the supply chain of this industry as well. So, you know, all in all, in 2022, we're competing for more qualified projects than we before. We facilitated more site visits here in Tucson that we've seen before. And so we think that future looks very bright. So this slide will kind of tell you what the future is for us. And so we're starting to talk about this out in the community more. You know, we are competing, but are we really competitive? It's always important to sit back in your businesses, and we do as well, and say, you know, what are we doing well? What could we improve? You know, we're community's assets, so we have to work with many partners in that endeavor. And so you may have heard some presentations already that we're making in the community, that our focus this year is a renewed focus on competitiveness. And Joe Snell has made this a priority for us, as well as our board and leadership. And so we're in the process of a number of actions to look at this competitiveness. We've first off promoted Susan Damone here on our staff. She is an important player for us in our client projects. She's talking to clients each and every day about their needs and about their challenges. And so she's going to be the staff lead on this endeavor. And so we'll be doing a number of different things. We're going to be conducting a gap analysis. We're going to see, you know, where are we now? Where do we want to be? What do we want to be as a community? Sorry, I have automatic lights here. What are the gaps? You know, what are we going to do to close these gaps? And then given these pipeline trends, we're going to reevaluate the targeted industry to verify that our assets really match those industries, and determine, you know, we're seeing automotive, we're seeing semiconductor. These are emerging targeted industries that we need to be well positioned to attract and to grow, especially in light of the CHIPS Act that was recently passed. We will review our current strategic plan and likely update it to reflect the outcomes of that gap analysis. You know, on the gap side, while we have ideas where our gaps exist and what the competitive issues are, we and have already started a very systematic, data-driven approach to really evaluate what these issues are. So these results won't be based on what our staff necessarily thinks, but what we learn both quantitatively and qualitatively through the research and data. You know, we really believe here at Suncorda that our region is on the cusp of winning some really exciting new companies that could have a major impact on increasing the prosperity in our community. So that concludes my presentation. I think I'll turn it back over to Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Laura. It was really great to hear about Suncorda's efforts to bring new businesses to Tucson, and a little bit about the current projects you guys have in the pipeline and some of the emerging industries that are interested in Tucson. Really interesting. Thank you so much for joining us today. And again, if you have questions for Laura, please put them in the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll ask them at the end of the presentation. So I am now going to reshare my screen, and find my controls for, sorry about that, just one second. There we go. I assume everybody can see my PowerPoint presentation. If you can't, I think Georgia or Laura will probably let me know. So I'm going to wrap things up here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the current trends in Tucson's housing market. And so again, we'll have lots of time at the end for questions. So put those in that chat or the Q&A or email them to Val, and she'll monitor any questions that come in during this presentation. So today I'm going to start with kind of what's happening with housing. So we're going to talk about what we've seen with median home prices and rental prices, and then we'll go into what that means for affordability, both homeowners, renters, and then another way that we look at affordability, which is through housing cost burden trends. And then we'll wrap up with kind of what's happening with inventory and housing permits in Tucson over the last couple months. So between 2020 and 2021, we saw Tucson's median home price increase by 24.9%. So it went from $265,000 in 2020 to $331,000 in 2021. So again, that was a 25% increase over that 1 year time. Despite the large increase in home prices over that year, you can see that Tucson still remains a relatively affordable or low, a market with a low median home price relative to its pure metropolitan areas. So these are the 11 other pure metropolitan areas that we always compare Tucson to on the map dashboard. So these are all regions that are similar to Tucson in some way. Most of them have a similar population. They have a large research university or a large military installation. You can see here, Tucson falls just behind the nation now at 331,000 in 2021, but well behind places like San Diego, which is off this gauge at 830,000, Denver at 607,000, Portland here at 536,000. And there's only 3 metros that have lower median home prices. This is a single family price, lower than Tucson, and that would be 2 in Texas, El Paso and San Antonio, and then Albuquerque. And all 3 of those are currently under 300,000. So Tucson at a growth rate of 24.9% between 2020 and 2021 grew at with the second fastest among its pure metropolitan areas, just ahead of Phoenix, which is just slightly below around 24%. But Austin here grew at the fastest, 33%. And we see other geographies here like El Paso, San Antonio that grew, around 12-14% compared to Tucson, Phoenix here in the 24 to 25% range. Nationally, home prices grew at about 17% during that same time period. We saw similar trends with rent, and we'll look at that in just a minute. But this graph, we have 3 different trend lines for home prices. We have the dark red line, which is the Case-Shiller median home price for Phoenix, and this is with a long lag, so it's not yet picking up what we've seen over the last couple of months. So we're going to focus on the other 2 lines, this blue dash line that you see right here, and that's for the median home price from the MLS for Phoenix, and then this black line that you see here, which is the median home price from the MLS for Tucson. And so you can see here, starting around 2019, we started to see a pretty sharp increase in home prices and the median home price for both Phoenix and for Tucson. But then if you focus right in this area, the last couple of months, you can see that home price has actually declined. And so we have seen that in Phoenix, the price for a single family home, the median price maxed out at $510,000 in May of this year, and it has fallen by almost 7% to $475,000 in August. And then Tucson has a similar story, though the decline's been a little bit lower. Tucson maxed out, median home price maxed out at $370,000 in June and July, and it has fallen to $356,000 in August of this year, and that represents just under a 4% decline. So this has been driven by increasing interest rates in part, right? We're seeing an increase in inventory, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So really that increase in interest rates, we're seeing at around 7%. has really kind of slowed down the housing market a little bit and actually caused it to decline a little over the last couple months. Here's that rent. I wanted to show you average rental prices. They also increased significantly during the same time period. So 2020 to 2021, the average rent for a 1 and 2 bedroom apartment in Tucson increased by just under 17%. So Tucson at the second quarter of 2022 had rental prices at around 1,400, just under 1,400. You see, it was around 13,500. That is comparable to the US. You also see Phoenix up here at just over 1,600 for a 1 and 2 bedroom apartment. That's the average rent for 1 and 2 bedroom apartments in Phoenix. So just like home prices, we have seen rent prices increasing as well. So what does that mean for affordability? This data here looks at the quarterly data for housing affordability, and you can see that this is the second quarter of 2022. We had 40.6% of homes in Tucson were considered affordable. So this is looking at what are homes selling for, and what is the median family income in the area, what is the interest rate, and then there's a calculation of what percentage of those homes that are being sold are affordable to someone earning that median family income. And in the second quarter of 2022, that was 40.6% of those homes were affordable to someone earning the median family income. Now you can see a year prior, in the second quarter of 2021, here on the fuel gauge, that was 65.3%. So we saw that affordability, that percentage of affordable homes fall by more than 25 percentage points in 1 year. Now, Tucson still remains affordable, like Laura mentioned, to many of our pure metropolitan areas. You can see when we start to look at other areas around the Western US, we have a lot larger percentage of homes that are still considered affordable relative to places like San Diego, which is at 6.9%, Portland at 19.3%, Las Vegas, 21.9%, Phoenix down there at 22.3%. But Tucson has become increasingly less affordable over the last couple of years. You can see it's now below the nation, whereas before we had much higher affordability rates than the nation. We can look at this for Tucson compared to the other metropolitan areas in Arizona and for the US. And so this is now compared to, instead of 1 year, we go back a little bit further, and we're going to look at this compared to the fourth quarter of 2019, because this is when home prices really started to increase rather rapidly, and we started to see significant declines in affordability. So you can see the US here in the fourth quarter of 2019, the percentage of homes that were considered affordable to someone earning the national median family income was 63.2%. In Tucson, and then it fell by the second quarter of 2022 to 42.8%. Here's Tucson, 71.2% of homes were considered affordable to someone earning Tucson's median family income. All of these are relative to their region's family income. So this is 71.2% of homes being sold were affordable to someone earning Tucson's median family income. That fell more than 30 percentage points to 40.6% by the second quarter of 2022. Phoenix fell by more than 40 percentage points during that time period. So went from 64.9% to 22.3%. These slides will all be available on the map dashboard when we post the recording. So if you're interested in looking at these later and looking at how the other metros in Tucson kind of fell during that time period, you can download them there. And then here's kind of that long-term trend for the US, Tucson, and Phoenix for housing affordability. And you can see right here, 2019 is where we started to really see a lot of rapid decline in affordability. And you can see kind of how that played out for Phoenix, Tucson, and US for each of those quarters. So that's the fourth quarter of 2019, fourth quarter of 2020. Not a lot of movement, but then you start to see into 2020, quarter one and quarter two, significant declines in that affordability for Tucson, Phoenix, and the US. Now, we'd like to think about affordability in a variety of ways, because we often hear we often are saying that Tucson's affordable relative to our pure metropolitan areas, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Tucson's affordable for everyone. And so on the map dashboard, we look at another measure called housing cost burden, and this looks at the percentage of households that are paying more than 30% of their income in their housing costs. So homeowners, that would be their mortgage; renters, that would be their rent, what they pay for rent, and as well as their utilities. And so in Tucson in 2020, we saw right here, Tucson falls relatively low compared to its pure metropolitan areas, with an affordability rate of around, we got 32, I think it was 32.8% of households in the Tucson metropolitan area are housing cost burden. So 32.8% of households are spending more than 30% of their income on their housing related expenses. And this is important because research has shown that those households that pay more than 30% of their income on their housing related expenses have a difficult time paying for other things like childcare, healthcare, and sometimes even food. So now we're going to break it down by tenure. So on the map dashboard, if you visit the map, all of these visualizations are interactive. You can hover over each of these bars, get the actual percentage. You can click on and off owner renter. We have data for all 12 of our metropolitan areas, as well as the US, the 10 Western states, and then when available, also all 15 Arizona counties. And you can download this data by using this little menu right here. You click on it, you can download the data into a CSV or an Excel file. You can save these images. You can use them in your presentations, and we encourage you to do that. So here we can see, if we break this down by owner and renter, that it's pretty consistent across Tucson, Arizona, and the US, but that just over 20% of homeowners are considered housing cost burden, but 50%, more than 50% of renters in the Tucson metropolitan area are considered housing cost burden. It's very similar for Arizona, and for the US, they fall just under 50%. So more than double when we separate out homeowners versus renters. So more than half of renters are paying more than 30% of their income in their rent and their utilities. We have an upcoming feature article on the map dashboard that highlights some of the diversity, equity, and inclusion in data. And in that, we have this housing cost burden households for renters by race and ethnicity. So of those 50% or 51% of renters that are considered housing cost burden, how does that kind of break out by different races and ethnicities? And so you can see here that in Tucson, the Asian or Pacific Islanders have a much higher housing cost burden rate than nationally. Same for Native Americans. And so over 60% of Native Americans are considered housing cost burden. And if you go to that article on the map dashboard, we have all of this underlying data available. So you can click on these grayed out geographies. The map will regenerate with that data, and you can see how Arizona compares to California, or how Tucson compares to Colorado Springs. Additionally, we break this data out by income. And so this is where it really becomes striking about how Tucson is affordable for some, but not for others. And so if we look at kind of those upper income brackets, this is the percentage of households that are housing cost burden in Tucson, how does that fall out across the different income distributions, right? So we see that if you earn 75% or 75,000 or more in Tucson, 4% of those households are housing cost burden, compared to 10.4% nationally. So that's telling us that in Tucson, those in the higher income brackets, really, they don't have a hard time finding affordable housing, especially compared to their peers nationally or even statewide. But when we look at the lower income brackets, those earning less than 20,000 to 35,000, we have a much higher percentage of our households that are considered housing cost burden. So 40.7% for those earning less than 20, almost 30% for that 20 to 35,000 income bracket. And those rates are much higher than what we're seeing nationally. And so that tells us that while, yes, we are affordable relative to some of our Western peers, we still have a lot of work to do in terms of affordability for those in our lower income brackets, and that they struggle more than their national peers do to find affordable housing. So now we'll move on to permits. And so what we've been seeing here is that housing permits have been increasing when we look at the data compared to this time last year, but that's been primarily in multifamily permits. So that's that checkered bars that you're seeing here for Phoenix and for Tucson. And the dark blue bars are our single family permits. So yes, while housing permits have been increasing relative to this time last year, we're seeing most of that activity being in multifamily, and single family permits have actually declined. And then this is what the current active listings or housing inventory looks like. And so we have turned the corner in terms of housing inventory. We had a really low inventory at this time last year that was really driving up prices in the Tucson and Phoenix markets. We have seen housing inventory, a number of active listings increase over the last several months here as we've seen interest rates rise. And we know that interest rates are around 7%. There's a lot of uncertainty. George talked about the inflation still being high, shelter inflation in particular being very high. And so there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen if interest rates are going to continue to tick up. That is kind of the feeling that some are having lately, that we may see even higher interest rates than 7%. So that's going to continue to drive down affordability, right? So housing affordability is made up of what are home prices, what are houses being sold for, what is the income level, what is the interest rate that people are borrowing at, that 80%, they're assuming that someone's putting down X percentage and then they're borrowing, 75 to 85% on that home. And so that interest rate really factors into that affordability. And so as we see interest rates continue to rise, we see that home prices rose much, much faster than income did over the last couple of years. Income has increased, but it hasn't increased at the same rate as home prices. And that has really driven down affordability in our region and around the Western US. Tucson is not unique. Tucson and Phoenix are not unique. Affordability has declined really across the board nationally. But we expect, as we continue to see interest rates rise and income maybe not keeping pace with the home price increases that we saw over the last couple of years, that affordability will stay down kind of in the near term. But housing affordability has increased, and that's going to kind of slow down those increases in home prices or depress them a little even. So some of the key takeaways, some I just mentioned about affordability, but that home prices increased rapidly in 2021, but have since declined over the last couple of months. There's a little uncertainty, like I just mentioned, with interest rates about what's going to happen in the near future. And then housing affordability drops significantly, will likely remain depressed in the near term. Inventory has increased from historic lows. We had historic lows last year, the last couple of years for inventory. And then multifamily permit activity is up, but single family activity remains suppressed. And then I also took a look just at the recent information that's come out from the Tucson Association of Realtors. And they're showing that the home sales have continued to soften, with closed sales down significantly from a year ago. It was almost like 17%. And that time on market has increased or nearly doubled in August what it was last year. So with that, I am going to stop my presentation and we will open up to questions. All right. I think I have some questions here for George and Laura that I jotted down during their presentations. And so I think we'll start. One, I think that maybe both of you could answer, and that is, has there been an increase in Tucson jobs in the defense industry after the Ukraine invasion?
Well, I took advantage of being off screen for a while to look up the data for Pima County and the Tucson MSA for aerospace and defense jobs here in the state. And it's interesting, they are up significantly so far in 2022, actually up by about 1,000 jobs just so far this year. So we are seeing some nice, we are seeing nice increases in manufacturing employment across the state, and some big increases in a major industry here in Pima County.
Laura, have you seen any increased interest in that area?
George had the specific data about Raytheon. You know, Raytheon has assisted Ukraine. It's been reported widely. And they've also won, just to add on to what George said, they've won some very significant, sizable projects over the last several months and the last several years. So we should all be asking ourselves, what have we done for Raytheon lately? Because Raytheon is definitely a pillar of not only employment, but all the of Raytheon employees here in our community.
Thank you. George, let's go to you now and ask about some questions on housing. So the first is, what is your estimate of the rental housing inflation percentage relative to Phoenix in the US?
Well, I think that's one for you, Jennifer. We know rent prices are rising really rapidly, as are home prices. You know, we saw, I think I saw the Phoenix data, you know, the monthly rent is up, what, $400 a month?
Yeah, it was up. Yeah,
1,200.
it was 17% in Tucson. It was pretty similar numbers in Phoenix. Yeah.
Yeah, so big increases in rents, and that matters for the measurement of the consumer price index. And this is true nationally. You know, the rents are important for the overall index because, you know, what we pay in rent and the owner's equivalent rent, you know, accounts for 30 to 40% of a household's budget. So when we measure aggregate prices, it's a weighted average of all of the, you know, an estimate of all of the prices that things as part of our daily lives. So housing really matters. And the way rents are treated is, you know, when we're seeing there in your slide was an increase in market rents, but, you know, an increase in market rents only affects initially affects a small share of renters, because, you know, most renters are on an existing lease, you know, 1 or 2 year lease. But as we go over time, those leases turn over, then the market rates start to gradually feed in. So that's why it takes time for the shelter index to reflect these, you know, rapid increases in house prices and rents. And it's also why they're slow to reflect the you know, the deceleration or even outright declines in those prices. It takes time for those to be reflected in those new leases. So that's something to keep in mind as you think about inflation going forward.
Thank you, George. There was another question about housing permit data. And does that include built for rent and multifamily, the data that you were showing earlier? I know
Yes. Yeah, the data that that was total housing permits, which does include build for rent, and it does also include not only single family permits, but multifamily permits as well.
Right. And then we had the graph later that showed the individual multifamily and single family permit data. I think, Laura, a question for you. What relationship does Sun Quarter have with small businesses or local startups?
Well, as I mentioned before, our mission doesn't really depend on company size, as we're really industry driven or targeted industries. So if the business is 5 employees and in bioscience or any of our targeted industries or a primary job industry, then we do consider that a qualified project, just like a Roche-sized bioscience company. So in a real world example of that would be Reglagene, which was on our success list this year. I think 9 or 10 employees establishing and expanding here in the region. Now, if it's a retail-based small business, focus on non-retail primary industries. So no on that front, but there are many local chambers of commerce and other organizations that can support that business. And then you mentioned startups, right? Startups are really assisted by groups like Startup Tucson, by Tech Launch Arizona, by the Tech Parks growing network of incubators. So they would be the right source for that. So we are really mission driven. We have a small staff. We stay in our lane, just like organizations, you know, also stay in their lane. So there's no duplication happening out there in the market.
Thank you. And I think a really great wrap-up question for you, George, is, and if you have additional questions, please put them in the Q&A now, and we can always answer them via email. But what is the biggest concern looking out over the next 6 to 12 months?
Well, same as it was over the last 6 to 12. So what happens with inflation and how monetary policy deals with it? You know, one of the we've seen is a skyrocketing mortgage interest rate, which, you know, the latest data has it over 7%. The Federal Reserve with their September release indicated that they were going to raise their policy rate by 75 basis points. But, you know, what really I think shocked people, certainly me, was that they massively increased how much further they thought they were going to have to raise the policy rate, you know, up into the over 4% this year and up to maybe 4.6% or higher next year. So that an eye on what happens with monetary policy. How far does the Fed think it's going to need to go to bring inflation down, and how big of an increase in unemployment is required to accomplish that? You know, the other thing is something that we've all been concerned about for a lot of different reasons over the past year, and that's what's going on with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. What does that mean for commodity prices, for food prices, for energy prices? You know, we're in a situation that looks a lot like what we in these early 80s with, you know, big increases in energy prices, rapid inflation, rising interest rates. Hopefully we won't go through something quite as severe as that. But, you know, those are a couple of good things to keep in mind as we go forward. And, you know, also keep an eye out for something coming out of left field. You never know.
Thank you, George. We have a couple more questions, and I think we have time. So how does all this data relate to the small businesses like the mom and pop type?
The data itself does include small businesses. If that small business is an employer, it will be picked up in most of the data sets that we track. For sole proprietorships, there are some data sets that we track kind of periodically. I believe Val Rice, our senior business information specialist, is working on something that would address those sole proprietorships and the you know, really businesses. But you know, small businesses, if they're employers, they will generally be picked up by our data sets. And that's something that we do hear periodically from the community. I think it's something that would make a good article for us to feature on the MAP dashboard, taking a look at small business trends and what's happening in businesses by establishment size. So I think we should put that on the list.
All right, I wrote it down. And so one more question here: as an expanding business needs to grow our labor pool, what should we be able to expect to hire quality people in a tight labor market? In other words, are hiring employers going to get into a bidding situation to attract new hires?
Yes, that's where we are. That is what is happening now. And I think we're going to be there through probably the end of the year at least. You know, when we look at, you know, the employment situation here, we see two things: really, really low, in some cases, historically low unemployment rates, and just a mountain of open jobs. So we've tracked that data, you know, for Arizona. There were, you know, 61,000 more open jobs in Arizona as of July than there were before the pandemic began. So, you know, we'll just keep an eye on how that situation evolves as we go into next year. I think we'll see if there is no recession, I think we'll see a significant slowdown going through the next year, and that, you know, unemployment rate coming up and the open jobs coming down. And, you know, I think that will take some of the pressure off what is a heated labor market.
I have a comment also. I believe that's true too, but I think it's also important for a business to really sit back and evaluate their benefits and some of the sort of non-financial benefits that they offer potential employees. You know, a lot of talent nowadays, I keep up with a ton of talent research and what talent looks for in both communities and companies. And many of the younger talent in our economy are looking for those kinds of non-financial or work flexibility, for example, things of that nature. So anything a business can do to bolster those attractive benefits will also help as well.
And there's one final question that came in that asked, what is the lending trends for the banking industry?
That is a good question. That data exists. In a former life, I helped to track some of that data. It is available at the state level. Maybe that's something else we should put on the list for the map data. That would be interesting to see. Okay,
well, I think that's all the questions we have. Great. Thank you so much, George and Laura. I really enjoyed both your presentations. And thank you everyone for the great questions, and sign up for the MAP newsletter if you haven't already. It's a great way to stay up to date on new events that we have coming out like these.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks, Laura.
Thank you.
Great to see you. Great to see everyone.
Bye.
Bye.